Stay tuned. Ahead, I'll talk with Dr. Lydia Kang and Nate Pederson about pseudoscience, an amusing history of crackpot ideas and why we love them. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Lydia Kang, MD, is a practicing internal medicine physician and author of young adult and adult fiction. Nate Pederson is a librarian, historian, and freelance journalist whose work has appeared in over 400 publications in print and online. They join us to talk about pseudoscience. Lydia and Nate, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much. We're glad to be here.
Well, this is another in a series of books that you've written. Why did you decide this time to take a look at pseudoscience?
Well, pseudoscience was kind of a natural progression from the first book that we wrote together, which was Quackery, A Brief History of the Worst Ways to Cure Everything. And there was a lot of pseudoscience in that book, although that was really kind of anchored in history, like from a long time ago, things that we did hundreds, thousands of years ago that don't make medical sense today. So this was a little bit of a continuation, but now we're looking at some contemporary things that are a little bit more recent in our history. But they have a lot of sort of similarities. And so it was kind of a natural jump for us to go from quackery to pseudoscience.
So give us a brief overview of this book before we look at a few specific samples to give us an idea of what people will find here.
Well, I think a lot of the sort of overall intent of the book is expressed in the subtitle. So the subtitle for our book is an amusing history of crackpot ideas and why we love them. So the intent of the book isn't to point fingers so much at people that believe in pseudoscientific things. That's something that we've all fell prey to at different times, or that we've purposely engaged in, because a lot of these can be really fun to talk about and to at least temporarily or believe in for a little bit of time. So the intent of the book was to use that lens to look at the scope of history and talk a lot about these fun stories that hopefully educate as well as entertain and provide some insight into the kind of the mysteries of the human condition, right? So like what makes it interesting for us to always want to pretend the Bermuda Triangle is this haunted stretch of ocean, or why do we always want to blame aliens for everything we see around us, right? What makes the world more interesting and mysterious to people because of that? And so the book uses that lens to look at history and hopefully provides a bit of a fun journey along the way as we investigate some of these pseudoscientific theories.
Well, and there are things you point out here that have either there's no evidence to support it, or it's been clearly debunked, but people continue to believe in them. Why is that?
Oh gosh, there are a lot of reasons why. I think that there is something really enchanting about the idea that there are mysteries and secrets out there in the world. And our human nature is that we're always trying to find the answers. We're always trying to find the truth. I mean, how many times did you hear about something you didn't know and you immediately go to Wikipedia and look it up? And but there have been these pervasive themes that we've always had some curiosity over, but having maybe gotten the complete answers to. So I would take UFOs as an example, or as we sort of are supposed to call them now, UAPs, or unidentified aerial phenomenon. So, the government's actually doing studies to find out what are some of these sightings that are oftentimes seen by military pilots, so they're coming from pretty legitimate sources, but we don't understand what they are. And I think people really love the idea that there's a possibility that there's an unknown out there, like aliens or, like Bigfoot, things like that. So I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is that the way that pseudoscience works, it's not the same way as science works as far as using the scientific method. People who are very deeply entrenched in certain pseudoscientific beliefs are very resistant to the fact that, their beliefs should change with data. And so regular science naturally adapts and alters and is constantly being questioned and adapts to that. Pseudoscience does not. So there are these big differences between the two, but I think there's also just always this background of why we want to continue to believe in the things that maybe are disproven, but that people don't want to know that they've been disproven, or they don't want to believe that they've been disproven.
And I think a classic example of that you examine in the book is flat earthers. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that the world is a globe, it's a spherical, but they reject those facts.
Yes, yes. And, we actually had a little fun when we were writing that chapter because we like to put into some of the chapters, like, why do people think this? Like, is there a logic to their understanding of why they think the earth might be flat? And the truth is, if you're standing on the shores of Lake Michigan and you look out into this vast lake, it looks pretty flat. And so you can imagine why some people might be like, well, I distrust large institutions. I think it's a big, hoax that people are, putting on us that, what we believe to be solid science is not actually solid. And so a lot of the beliefs behind flat Earth is like, well, if I can't see it with my own eyes, then it's not real. So one of the highlights of the book is about a man who tries to build his own rocket to get high enough to see if the Earth is actually a globe and not flat. So it's a really interesting, kind of sad story, honestly, about his mission to prove this and see things with his own eyes.
I want to touch on a couple of more because there's so much in the book. We can't talk about all of them, but I would like to talk about a few more. And one of them that you address in the book is this idea about spontaneous human combustion. Where did that idea originate? Why do people still believe in it?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So a lot of the belief around spontaneous human combustion came out of the scientific discovery of oxygen, essentially. So in the late 18th century, oxygen was isolated for the first time, and scientists were able to ascertain that oxygen was necessary not only for combustion, so for the creation and continuation of a flame, a fire, but also for breathing. And it led to this temporarily embraced theory that the act of breathing itself was an act of combustion. So as you're breathing, there's these little fires that are engaged in your lungs, and those, do all sorts of things, I suppose, to maintain your body warmth or to help with circulation. And it's to me, it's kind of a beautiful theory. I like this idea of your lungs having all these little fires and then these little campfires, these little pinpricks of light, in the darkness of your body. But it's of course not true. However, if you think it's true, then there's other problems that start to come out of that. Like obviously, that suddenly makes us extraordinarily flammable as entities, right? And then B, if you start adding in other things into your body, particularly alcohol, then you're quite literally adding fuel to the fire, right? And so the theory was for a little while that in particular this landed on people that drank a lot, on alcoholics and so on, that by virtue of sort of dousing their internal organs with alcohol, they were creating a very potentially flammable situation. And kind of at random, then people were thought to just sort of burst into flame. Unfortunately, well, that is possible to burst into flame. There's always an external source of that ignition. It's not from inside of your body. So we don't actually have fires in our lungs. And it took a little while for people to fully understand that. But unfortunately, in combustion events where people are set on fire through various means, like perhaps they're falling asleep and a cigarette fell under their clothing, it creates a situation that leads to a scientific process called the wick effect, which is a pretty gross thing to learn about. But basically, your human body fat acts as sort of the wax of the candle, and the wick is your clothing, and those two things work together to create a very bad situation very quickly sometimes, and it can lead to mysterious looking deaths where forensic investigators come in and someone's gone. I mean, they're essentially burnt to embers. There's barely anything left, but the surrounding environment isn't particularly affected because the candle, quote unquote, sort of burned itself out in that little space there. And those deaths can appear mysterious, and that's what's led to the continuation of this theory of spontaneous human combustion.
I'm talking with Dr. Lydia Kang and Nate Pederson about pseudoscience, an amusing history of crackpot ideas and why we love them. And our conversation continues in a moment. If you're enjoying this conversation, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. And thank you. One of the many other things that you address in the book is crypto-zoology, and specifically Bigfoot. So why do we continue to be fascinated with Bigfoot?
Probably because we've never captured one. We've never actually caught it. and prove that he existed. And so as long as like Bigfoot or this species of ape-like monster isn't captured, he continues to live on in the shadows of our world. So again, one of the hallmarks of pseudoscience is that like you can't do a scientific investigation. Like it's kind of unprovable. So as long as Bigfoot is not found, he can't be proven to not exist, right? So people love the idea of just, these mystical beasts that are around. Our world has been overexplored and overmined and overforested. I mean, there's no mysteries to the corners of the earth anymore. And I think there's something really romantic about the idea that there are these hidden creatures that are just trying to stay very far away from humans, and we get little glimpses of them. And I think internally we're all kind of cheering for the possibility that there are still undiscovered places and undiscovered creatures. So I think that's why they sort of live in the hearts and minds of everybody. And it's kind of a funny fact, but apparently there's been a Bigfoot sighting in every state in the country. But every state also has its own cryptid, depending on what state you live in. I'm in Nebraska, and so the most famous cryptid here is the alkali lake monster. And when I grew up in Maryland, it was Chessie, which was our Nessie version of living in the Chesapeake Bay. And it's kind of fun to have that mascot, or to know that there's something special hidden away in your own neighborhood.
Another area that I've found fascinating in your book are a couple of things I want to discuss that have been commonly accepted as having value, but really it still falls in that area of pseudoscience. Things like a polygraph that a lot of us think, no, that's scientific, that must be real, but perhaps it's not.
Not really. And the thing is that we don't have a real lie detector test, one that has 100% accuracy. So in the absence of having something that we can use, we have the polygraph, which has been used for, many, many decades. Interestingly, the prototype of it was invented by the same guy who invented Wonder Woman with her lie detecting golden lasso. But the accuracy for lie detector tests, a lot of people throw out this number 90%. But every time they really look at the data, it's not terribly good. And so it's not admissible for use in like a federal court, for example. But on the state level, it sort of depends on what state you live in. What's shocking is how often it's actually used to hire and to watch people who are working within the government. It's kind of fascinating that your taxpayer dollars are working to pay for a machine that is not considered to be highly accurate. So
another one that you talk about is something that's been adopted by a lot of businesses and other organizations. That's the Myers-Briggs personality test. Mm-hmm. And people take it, they get rated in certain areas, and sometimes that plays into employment, whether they think you're going to be a good fit for the organization. But that's not really valid either.
No, it's not considered valid. From the American Psychological Association does not consider it a valid instrument. It was kind of randomly thought up by a woman and her daughter in the beginning of the last century, who just thought people have different personalities, and so she cobbled together this Myers-Briggs instrument for personalities based on some of Carl Jung's ideas. But in the modern day, the data does not support its validity. People who take the test, a year or two later will get a completely different answer. And that's not really how personality is supposed to work, or personality traits are supposed to work. But it's a huge industry. It's millions and millions of dollars. And the actual personality type industry is like $1 billion industry. So there's a lot of people who want it to continue to be used, even though some of the testing, like the ocean testing, has more validity behind it. But Myers-Briggs is not considered to be valid, and no psychologist or psychiatrist with a degree uses it in their practice.
Well, that's one of the things I appreciate about this book. You've got these really wild things that you'd say, no, of course that's not right. And then you've got these things like we were just discussing that a lot of people accept as being valid, but it's not really. So a lot of things that you researched for this book, and this is a question for both of you. what would you say surprised you the most, or what was the most outlandish thing you discovered as you were doing your research? And Nate, I'd like to start with you. What kind of blew your mind when you were doing this research?
That's a great question. I think a uniting thread of the research to me that's interesting is this kind of drive that humans have to create mystery around them, even if that mystery doesn't exist anymore, like if science has disproven it. And I think that's kind of just an interesting thing about us as a species, like me as an individual as well. You take a look at something like crop circles, for example, which initially were thought to be extraterrestrial created, and that's still a theory that's bandied about a lot. But really, what they are complex pieces of art created by humans over a short period of time. And so I think that's kind of a beautiful thing, right? That like sometimes, while you might initially be disappointed to learn that it's not an alien that came down last night and created this pattern in your cornfield, it's also kind of cool that a human was able to produce something as beautiful as that, as quickly as that, with tools that are initially seemingly mysterious. But to get back to the other part of your question, for me, the most kind of outlandish thing, the most interesting thing that I researched and that we've thoroughly debunked now is the process of using chickens to interpret the will of the gods and then base major statecraft and political and military decisions on the behavior of chickens. And this was a practice that got way out of hand in ancient Rome when there was literally a job, like a job that you could aspire to have, was to be basically a chicken keeper and interpreter of the will of the gods through the behavior of those chickens. So you would let these chickens out of the cage and you'd feed them grain, and their enthusiasm for that grain led you to be able to interpret the will of the gods. And then you could in turn advise military and political leaders on how to go about their day or go about their war or go about their major political decision they're contemplating. And major things happened in history because of someone's random interpretation of what a chicken did. So, the power of the chicken to influence history is one of the more interesting and outlandish things from my research.
Yeah, and I would say for me, probably the most outlandish thing I came about was when I was researching was, we like to use the human body as a way to try to portend the future or our fortunes, such as palm reading, things like that. And I discovered that Sylvester Stallone's mother actually was a rumpologist, which is that she used people's bottoms to try to discern what kind of future they had, what kind of personality they had by, looking at a print of their buttocks or looking at their buttocks. And it's so out there. I don't think there's anybody who can't laugh at that because it's so outlandish. But yeah, that was probably one of the most far-fetched things that I came about in my research. And just also echoing what Nate says, I think it's very, very true that we, love the idea when it comes to things like auguries, when it comes to body divination is, we live in a really complicated world and we need guidance. And so I think people really find a lot of comfort in these pseudoscientific ways of giving them a little bit of insight into their future, their choices, their personalities. And a lot of them are pretty harmless. And I think it's a lot of fun for everybody to kind of be okay with it. Some of them are less harmless. So, but overall, it was just an incredibly fun book to research and write.
Well, there's much more in this book than we have time to talk about. So to learn more, the book is Pseudoscience, an amusing history of crackpot ideas and why we love them, by Dr. Lydia Kang and Nate Pederson. Lydia and Nate, thank you for talking with me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much for having us. It's been a pleasure.
If you'd like to purchase Pseudoscience, I've placed a link for you in the description below. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more books you might find interesting. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.